Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I'm Sandra Sukran. I'm director of the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, or SALISES. It is a pleasure to welcome you all to the online panel discussion being hosted by SALISES titled On the Road to COP29, Navigating the Climate Finance Landscape for Caribbean SIDS. I'm happy to see so many participants joining us from different corners of the world. We're all united by our commitment to tackling the urgent climate challenges facing our Caribbean small island developing states. At SALISES, we are dedicated to promoting sustainable development, social equity, and economic resilience. Our mission aligns perfectly with today's topic as we recognize that significant investments in adaptation and mitigation strategies are vital for our survival and resilience in the face of a changing climate. We have an exciting lineup of presentations ahead. We will begin with a funding gap analysis to quantify the financial needs of Caribbean SIDS and explore the barriers to accessing necessary funds. Following that, we will explore the financial challenges that our nations face, including the concept of the climate debt trap, which can hamper our economic growth. Next, we'll examine the loss and damage concept and discuss how climate finance can help mitigate these irreversible impacts. Finally, we'll examine the essential role of civil society in driving climate action in our region by sharing strategies and success stories that highlight their impact. So, as we embark on this vital conversation, let us remember that understanding the opportunities and challenges associated with climate finance is important in navigating the complexities of climate change together. Before we begin the session, I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's discussion, Geneva Oliverie. Geneva is a dedicated professional with over a decade of experience in international trade and development policy. She has held several important roles at the Ministry of Trade and Industry in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean Policy Development Center in Barbados. Currently, she serves as the Deputy Director of International Financial Reform at the Climate Vulnerable Forum, where she focuses on redirecting financial flows towards debt relief and climate resilience for vulnerable countries. Geneva also plays a vital role in raising awareness about the impact of debt on our region, and she represents us at international policy events. Thank you all for being here today. I look forward to the engaging discussion ahead as we continue to work together to chart a sustainable path for our region in the lead up to COP29. With that, I'll hand it over to Geneva to guide us through this important conversation. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sukram, and thank you for laying the stage and setting the stage, I should say, for what we're about to discuss over the next 2 hours. I think it's a critical time for us. It's a very important moment for us, not just internationally, but when we really narrow in a small island developing states in the Caribbean, this is our time to really try to influence some of the decisions that could push towards and boost our own sustainable development goals. So without much ado, I know we have a very robust bunch of discussions ahead of us. I would like to introduce the panelists, our esteemed panelists, and in no particular order. Sasha, Jattansingh, I would like to introduce you first. Sasha Jattansingh is a climate finance and participatory environmental governance professional with over 15 years of experience in public, international development, and civil society sectors. And, you know, in Trinidad and Tobago, I see that, Sasha, I see that as something fantastic. I think you come into this discussion with perspective, and we definitely welcome that. She is currently the loss and damage expert at Climate Analytics Caribbean, where she works with Caribbean small island developing states to address critical issues related to loss and damage, adaptation, and the climate justice. Sasha has a strong background in environmental and climate policy, climate finance, participatory governance, grants management, capacity building, and science communication. Prior to joining Climate Analytics, Sasha was the Commonwealth National Climate Finance Advisor to Antigua and Barbuda, where she supported the government of that country to strengthen its institutional and technical capacity to access and mobilize climate finance. And we know how important that is now in the current reform agenda. Prior to this, Sasha has worked with the Global Green Growth Institute, the United Nations Development Programme, Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, the University of the West Indies, our host, and the government of Trinidad and Tobago on climate change and sustainable development issues. She's the holder of a Masters of Science in Environmental Policy and Regulation, truly dedicated to climate and environment, and we appreciate that, from the London School of Economics and Political Science, a Masters of Engineering in Environmental Engineering from the University of Auckland, and an Honours Bachelor of Science in Environmental Science from the University of Toronto. Interestingly, she's currently an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity at the London School of Economics International Inequalities Institute, where her real focus is on climate justice, loss and damage, and participatory governance. So, Sasha, you have really narrowed your focus and become really carved out your niche, and we appreciate having you on our panel today, and I definitely look forward to hearing your perspective. Next, we have Dr. Ainka Granderson, and she is a Trinidad and Tobago national, born and raised, and a climate advocate. She is a climate adaptation specialist and has over 8 years of experience working in climate change and environmental management in the Caribbean and Pacific small island developing states. Currently, she is a resilience program manager at the Caribbean National Resources Institute, CANARI, overseeing the portfolio of projects on climate change and disaster resilience across the region. We know how important that is now for us, more so with the increasing, I guess, incidents of hurricanes and other events. So she also co-convenes the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, which brings together over 50 civil society organizations, grassroots leaders and activists, academics, creatives, media, and other non-state actors to promote climate justice. She has a PhD in resource management and geography from the University of Melbourne, Australia, a Masters of Science in Conservation Biology and Sustainable Development from the University of Wisconsin, Madison, and a Bachelor of Arts degree with honors in geography from the University of Cambridge, UK. Welcome, Dr. Granderson. It's good to see you again. Jwala Rambarran, no stranger to the development circle. Jwala Rambarran is a distinguished fellow of this Sustainable Development Finance Program at Climate Works Foundation. He supports the grant-making strategy of the Sustainable Finance Program, particularly the role of governments in shifting and mobilizing public finance to speed up a global and just green transition. And in new areas such as adaptation finance, loss and damage, and nature-based finance. I really hope today we hear a lot about loss and damage, because I see that our panelists thus far have been focused on this particular area, and hopefully our attendees would be able to hear why there's a focus on that. Jwala brings 3 decades of experience working in international finance and sustainable development, including a past governorship of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago, as well as a role as the advisor to the executive director of the Brazilian constituency to the International Monetary Fund's executive board. Jwala is currently a member of the Task Force on Climate Development and the IMF, a global consortium of experts advocating for a development-friendly approach to climate change at the IMF. He's also a senior advisor to the Caribbean Policy Development Center based in Barbados, and to the Office of the Managing Director of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, Vulnerable Group of 20 CVF V20 on cross-cutting issues related to sovereign debt, climate finance, and reform of the global financial architecture. Jwala holds a prestigious certificate in sustainability and climate risk from the Global Association of Risk Professionals, GARP, and received his master's in financial economics from the University of London. Welcome, Jwala. Thank you very much. I know you're now returning from Washington, so we hope to hear a little bit more of the outcomes of that as well. And last but not least, Dr. Preeya Mohan, a Caribbean scholar who really has a passion for Caribbean sustainability, and that has really influenced her research and numerous publications. So she's really living what she believes and living her passion, and we appreciate you for that, Dr. Mohan. So much of her work has been around climate resilience, disaster risk management, and sustainable development in small island developing states. Her research topics are intersectional in scope and are aimed at finding solutions to the pressing development challenges facing the region. And I like the idea of finding solutions, Dr. Mohan, because oftentimes we complain, but really finding solutions is really the crux of the matter. So she is a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, SALISES. Our host, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. As a recipient of several research grants and awards, Dr. Mohan has worked on various research projects funded by international bodies, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Development Research Center, and the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. Dr. Mohan is actively involved in teaching, research supervision, a stakeholder engagement to raise public awareness of issues critical to Caribbean development. Climate policy, food policy, energy policy, ecological economics, tourism economics, and entrepreneurship and regional development are some of the international peer-reviewed journals in which Dr. Mohan has successfully published. Thank you, panelists, for being here. And attendees, perhaps, dear friends, you probably wondered, why did I go at length to really introduce in such detail? I think it's very important to understand the background of our panelists and what they bring to the table in an attempt to understand what perspective they also bring to currently what we will be doing. So without further ado now, I would like to now give each presenter 5 minutes to give their opening remarks, followed by questions that I would pose to them. And I would like to start the first section on bridging the climate finance gap, challenges and opportunities for Caribbean SIDS. So I would like to first start with Dr. Granderson. Could you please open the floor and really give your opening remarks on what you think this would be for all of us? Although I know climate finance is not really, so your perspective, your opening remarks generally, before we really get into the crux of the matter.
So thanks for that. So no problem. So thanks for that, Geneva. Morning, everyone. And I think I wanted to say a big thank you to the SALISES team for inviting me to be part of this key expert panel. It's really a pleasure to be here. And so I will be, I guess, talking about how we can empower Caribbean civil society for climate action and how that relates to this big issue around access to climate finance and how we can better deliver it on the ground to the most vulnerable. So I think it's important to recognize, and I think we probably all do, that civil society is key to a whole of society approach to tackling the climate crisis, including national and regional NGOs, community-based organizations, local resource users like small-scale farmers and fisherfolk, and individual activists. And they can help us, with practical actions to adapt and reduce emissions on the ground. They also help to amplify and advocate for community voices and needs, especially of the most vulnerable. And they also can help extend the capacities for implementation of local projects, particularly if we recognize that governments are often already stretched in terms of what they can do. But I think in order to empower civil society, it's helpful to understand their current capacities, including the ability to access and deliver finance and the ways in which they can influence policy decisions and shape the climate agenda. And so I wanted to start by sharing some findings from a scoping study that we conducted in 2021 by the Caribbean Natural Resources Institute, CANARI, as well as Climate Analytics and the International Institute for Sustainable Development, on the actual levels of access to finance for Caribbean civil society organizations, CSOs for short, and on mechanisms for engagement in climate change decision-making and their effectiveness. So based on our scoping, we identified over 300 climate change-focused projects that are led or co-led by CSOs, and that was up to 2020 in the CARICOM region. And most of these were national community level projects with an average grant of around US 50 to 65,000 US. And so these CSOs, just to understand what we're dealing with, have staff of less than 10, an annual budget of less than 250,000 US. Whereas there were a few regional projects that had an average grant of 1.1 million US that would be implemented by regional international CSOs that were much larger with more staff, or by consortia of national CSOs. And I think what was most interesting, and you did the scoping, was that the Jeff Small Grant Program, which many of us will be familiar with different islands, was the main funding source for civil society from that scoping. And so despite the fact that it has some challenges, it was seen as a model worth replicating for providing those small amounts of funding that suit the needs of the many smaller CSOs that are working at the community level. And
Okay.
interestingly, I think what you're seeing is that the large climate funds like the Adaptation Fund, the Green Climate Fund, etc., have been piloting enhanced direct access involving small grants to civil society organizations and other actors.
Thank
Um,
you
and
very
then
much
I
for that
think
opening. Thank you Dr. Granderson, thank you very much for that opening. I know we'll get a little bit deeper into the crux of that later on when we get into your section of the thing. So I would like to now hand over to Sasha Jattansingh. Could you give us your opening remarks before we get into the crux of it? What would you like to really have our listeners get from this session at the end of it, and what would you like to see addressed in the overall?
Okay. Hi, everyone. And firstly, I want to thank SALISES for inviting me to be part of this incredibly relevant webinar on unpacking climate finance ahead of COP29 for the Caribbean region. And my focus in this webinar and in my work is really on loss and damage and loss and damage finance. So looking at how loss and damage finance can be used to respond to loss and damage affecting SIDS, like here in the Caribbean. And we've had this historic decision for a new loss and damage fund and funding arrangements, which was operationalized last year. And this year, there's been a lot of development. The fund, the official name is now the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And what I think is important is for us to really unpack what does that mean in terms of how will this fund be capitalized? What about the actual design and operations of the fund? So looking at who's able to access the fund, so who's eligible, and then also looking at what are the access modalities. So what activities would constitute as being able to be funded from the loss and damage fund. Also looking at how responsive this fund is to really meet the scale and the urgency of the needs. So I think it's really understanding how this fund is going to work within this climate finance landscape and really serve to address the needs of the most vulnerable countries and communities that are really dealing with loss and damage. And it'll be quite interesting at COP29 to see how this plays out, noting that, COP29, we're calling it the finance COP because there we're going to be negotiating the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, the NCQG, and that's it's expected to replace the 100 billion US annual target that was set all the way back in 2009 for climate finance. So we'll see how this plays out, and I'm looking forward to getting further into the discussion in this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I would now like to go over to Jwala. Jwala, could you give us a little bit of a sense of Okma, what you hope to get from this session, what you would like the listeners to get from this session before then?
All right, sure. Thanks very much, Geneva, and like my fellow panelists, let me thank SALISES for the invitation to participate with my esteemed colleagues in this seminar. The anchor point to this seminar is around COP29, but I want to emphasize that COP29 is not a destination. It is part of a journey. Just a month ago, we concluded what was called Summit of the Future at the UN, which laid out a path towards at least the next decade from all developing countries. And last week, we completed the annual meetings of the IMF and World Bank, which dealt with a number of issues around the global financial architecture. We go to COP29, then we go to the G20 meetings. We have spring meetings next year, and we have financing for development. So it's really this journey that is taking us as Caribbean countries that are caught in what we call a climate debt trap. We're highly vulnerable, and we're very climate vulnerable. And it's really how do we obtain the sort of financing that is needed to help us escape this trap. But that means that we now have to talk about the changes within the global financial system, because a lot of a major reason why we are in this space is because it really reflects the inequalities that are embedded in the global financial architecture. And I think that's something that is key to what we need to be speaking about today. Thanks.
Thank you very much for your opening remarks, Jwala. And Dr. Mohan, I would like to now hand over to you to give your opening remarks, followed by some questions that I have for you, some very specific questions.
Thank you, Geneva. I want to begin by thanking all the panelists for graciously accepting the invitation. As soon as we asked, everyone agreed immediately and with enthusiasm, so thank you very much. Going into COP29, as Sasha mentioned, it's being dubbed the Climate COP, and I think it's important to focus on the NCQG and looking at that $100 billion per annum goal that would have been set that we've actually never realized. Out of that that goal, 2%, just 2% of that financing actually goes to small island developing states. So less than 2% of that financing actually goes towards Caribbean small island developing states. We are actually second in terms of the amount. The Pacific Islands beat us out in terms of accessing that 100 billion. So in my opening remarks, I want to point out the climate finance gap in the Caribbean. Looking at my own research, looking at the NDCs across the Caribbean, we see that in the region, we require US $51 billion to meet our climate finance goal. And this is actually a gross underestimation because half of the islands still need to quantify their climate mitigation and adaptation goals. Also, among the countries that would have estimated costs, all projects are not yet funded. So this $51 billion is actually an underestimate. And now if we were to look back during the period 2010 to 2015, we would see that Caribbean SIDS actually received just $1.33 billion in international climate finance. Now, this represents just 2.56% of this climate finance demand. So right away, we see a very large disparity in terms of our climate supply of finance and our climate demand of finance. Now, this is compounded by systematic factors in the region, which we will get into in the discussion, but I'll just list them out really quickly. Limited fiscal space, frequent occurrence of disasters, ineligible concessional financing because of our high income status, and the complex access to climate finance, that bureaucratic complex climate finance architecture. And we have a range of solutions in navigating these challenges, which would require a multi-pronged approach, which I hope in this session we can roll out together as a panel.
Thank you very, very much for that. And I think that our panelists now, they're familiar to everyone who is listening. So, Dr. Mohan, I would like to ask you, given that you were the last to open, and this section really speaks to much of the research that you have done, based on your analysis of the funding gap, what are the most urgent priorities for climate finance investment in Caribbean SIDS?
So before I get into the investment needs, I just want to elaborate a bit on the systemic factors that I didn't really get to touch before, because this would lead into that discussion in terms of the investments. So we have a very limited fiscal space, we have high debt. We've been in a high debt, low growth trap for the past 2 decades, which Jwala will speak to. Among SIDS globally, we have one of the highest debt to GDP ratios at 71%. We are frequently hit by natural disasters, which again exacerbates our debt. Also, despite being vulnerable to disasters, our high income status makes us ineligible for concessional financing and disaster aid once disasters occur. Now, writing project proposals for accessing climate finance, we have limited technical capacity in this area, which presents certain challenges. Now, in terms of the areas we would want to invest, first of all, we would want to look at climate resilient infrastructure. Given our vulnerability to climate impacts, this would be the obvious first priority. So we want to look at issues like coastal protection, so investing in coastal defenses such as seawalls and breakwaters to, protect our critical infrastructure and communities from coastal erosion and sea level rise. And in Barbados, we've been having a lot of coastal protection projects that look at seawalls and beach nourishment to mitigate coastal erosion. We want to look at the issue of disaster risk reduction, again, because of our vulnerability to disasters. So we want to strengthen early warning systems. We want to improve our disaster risk plans towards hurricanes. We want to disaster-proof our infrastructure. And a good example here would be Dominica, where post-Hurricane Maria, the government took up the mandate that they would become the first climate resilient country and really implement disaster risk reduction strategies. We also want to look at the issue of renewable energy and energy efficiency as a major part of our climate investment programs. This is given our high dependence on imported fuels and, of course, our high energy costs in the region. So we want to be able to finance renewable energy projects in solar, wind, geothermal. Now, a lot of the Eastern Caribbean islands have huge geothermal potential, but significant amounts of financing is required in order to bring these projects off the ground. We want to invest in energy efficiency. So we want to have energy efficient technologies. We want to have energy efficient buildings to lower our energy costs. Several hotels across the region have already adopted energy efficiency programs in terms of dimming of lights when you leave the room, etc. And the last point with renewable energy would be grid modernization. So this is a very important point, and Barbados is a good example here. So we want to be able to upgrade our electricity grids to be able to accommodate that increased renewable energy potential that we want to tap into. And the Caribbean Electric Utility Services Corporation, CARILEC, is working with member countries to modernize electricity grids and to accommodate increased renewable energy potential. But again, this requires access to financing. Another area I want to look at, which we often may ignore, is the area of sustainable agriculture, which is tied to food security and water security. Now, a report done by CARICOM and the UN World Food Programme shows that 2.8 million people, or 40% of the population in the English-speaking Caribbean, is actually at risk of food insecurity. While this is driven by climate change, other factors coming out of COVID-19 and the Russia-Ukraine war has exacerbated this problem, leading to food shortages and higher food prices. So an important area of investment would be climate-smart agriculture. So we want to be able to support sustainable agricultural practices that can adapt to climate change, using examples like agroforestry, conservation agriculture, drought-tolerant crop varieties, etc. And the last point I want to make, area of investment, would be ecosystem-based adaptation. So I began speaking about climate resilient infrastructure, looking at the built environment, but ecosystem-based adaptation is very important. It's cheaper than a lot of our built solution, and it also has the advantage of providing benefits for the community in terms of creating jobs, income, etc., especially for marginalized populations like women, youth. Also, it has the environmental benefits. So we want to be able to invest in mangrove and coral restoration. For instance, we want to be able to invest in forest conservation.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, for that very comprehensive look. I have so many questions coming out of that, but I would just let the panelists, the session go along, and then we would take, I'm sure our listeners have very similar questions to what I have. But a number of things stood out for me, especially the ecosystem-based adaptation and conservation agriculture and the likes. I know that we are net importers of food in the Caribbean, and then to have that added issue of the climate change affecting our food supply, I know that the food security and sovereignty is going to be of major concern in the coming years. So then from there, I would like to ask you, Dr. Mohan, how can we address the challenge of project readiness to ensure that SIDS, small island developing states, can effectively access available climate finance?
Okay, so as I said, generally accessing climate finance requires a multi-pronged approach in the region, okay? We really need to build a multi-pronged approach, but in terms of becoming more practical and project readiness, a priority would be capacity building and technical assistance. So we want to be able to strengthen institutional capacity. We want to be able to organize workshops for government officials, for project developers on topics such as climate finance mechanisms, project cycle management, and financial analysis. We want to be educated on the number of climate finance grants out there, the climate financing mechanisms, and the exact procedures as to how to access them. The loss and damage fund, as Sasha made mention, is going to be operationalized. We want to be able to develop the technical expertise in terms of how we are going to access that fund. So we want to, as I said, we need to also have technical assistance. We need to be able to hire consultants or partner with international organizations to provide this technical assistance in areas like environment impact assessment, social impact assessment, and financial modeling. Because when we create these projects, when we write these projects, these are the elements that need to go into these projects for us to be successful. Now, in order to do these things, we need to have some kind of training program, and this can be done perhaps in partnership with regional bodies like the CDB, so that we can build competencies in project development, procurement, and contract management. Another big area would be to actually develop bankable projects. So we could conceive of many projects, like I listed, ecosystem-based adaptation, climate smart agriculture. As experts, we can all list projects in the region that we require. But we need to turn these projects into what we call bankable projects. So we want to be able to prioritize high impact projects. We want to focus on projects that are going to have a significant impact to climate resilience. And this would be like your renewable energy projects, your coastal protection projects. In order to do this, we need to conduct feasibility studies. We need to strengthen project design. We also need to engage with the private sector to really fund these projects. So Republic Bank, for instance, has declared that they're going to make $200 million available up to 2030 to finance renewable energy projects in the Caribbean. This is a private sector stakeholder. If we do not design the bankable projects, we are not going to be able to access that 200 million. So it's very important that we are able to develop bankable projects.
Okay, thank you very much for that. You know, I'm hearing you talking about bankable projects, and from my own organization, the Climate Vulnerable Forum V20, there's this program called the Climate Prosperity Plans, which actually aims to do that, help countries identify what are the bankable projects that requires investment, and then tout the investment from, I guess, agencies such as Republic Bank and other funding institutions. I think it's a worthwhile thing that you're saying that every country should have its own prosperity plan should have its own list of bankable projects that would require funding and how much funding is needed so that when they go to donors and funders, they know exactly what they're asking for. So I definitely take that statement, and I think that's something that we could all think about as we continue with the discussion. So thank you very much, Dr. Mohan. We'll come back to you a little bit later. And of course, in between, I would throw questions at anyone in the panel. I know that there's a run of show, and I know I've gone off the tangent a little bit, but I'll now go over to Jwala, and you could always give your presentation, and then I'll get into some very.
Thanks, Geneva. If I could just segue straight into that final part of what Dr. Mohan was speaking about, which is really around the role of indigenous financial institutions in helping to unlock and mobilize some of the climate finance that is needed here in the region. And first, for that to happen at the broadest level, we need our central banks to be involved in this space. And so far, central banks in the Caribbean have been really quiet in terms of what their contribution could be through either monetary policy, through changing the levers of financial regulation, through their financial stability mandate, in terms of how they could encourage the indigenous financial institutions to be part of coming to the table to provide the funding that is needed, right? Now, you spoke about Republic Bank and providing this headline $200 million. Republic Bank was also supposed to be instrumental in providing $100 million for agriculture as part of CARICOM's 20 by 25 initiative. That hasn't gone anywhere, right? And a lot of it is because there is nothing happening from the side of the regulator, the financial regulator, to create the environment for these sort of projects to be financed and for them to happen, right? Let me just come now to the issue around the climate debt trap. Dr. Mohan again talked about beautifully and comprehensively laid out all the issues, challenges, and constraints and solutions. The climate financing gap. So our minimum estimated needs around, you said about 55, that's about 55 billion US with the Dominican Republic. If we back out DR and we just look around the 14 CARICOM members, that number is about just over about 30 to 35 billion US, which coincidentally is the size of the Caribbean's external debt. So you immediately see that there's really, when we start to talk about it, there's no fiscal space, right? Your debt is about as large as your minimum climate financing needs. And therefore, there has to be a way to come to really break from that debt trap. But it is easier said than done. And one of the reasons is that, first, the Caribbean's debt is about close, just over, let's say about 70 billion US. Half of that is domestic debt, half of that is external debt now, right? On the external debt side, the profile has shifted. It has moved away from the traditional bilateral creditors that we know as the Paris Club, the group of major industrial countries. And we really now owe more money to the private capital markets, essentially we call it Wall Street, and to China, as well as a lot more now to the multilateral development banks, particularly the World Bank and the IDB, right? And why is that important? Because if we start to talk about breaking through from this climate debt trap, then we need to talk about how do we start restructuring these components of debt. And the first thing is the multilateral debt is not up for restructuring because these institutions are what we call preferred creditors. They don't restructure debt unless it's in the context of a full multilateral initiative, like how we had the enhanced HIPC initiative. So put that aside. Second one, China. China is now the single largest bilateral creditor to many Caribbean countries. And China has been very reluctant to come to the debt restructuring table for a number of reasons. And one of the main ones is that it is unwilling to provide debt relief if that relief ends up paying commercial creditors. And that's the next most difficult part. We don't have technical capability to really meaningfully engage with Wall Street when we have to restructure our debt. Right? A simple example, look at Suriname. Suriname is the last Caribbean country that went through a debt restructuring that took over 3 years. And the final result is that Suriname didn't win in that debt restructuring. Right? It has come at a tremendous cost to the country, and it may eventually come at tremendous political cost as well. So at the end, what we need, and I saw there was a question in the chat, what are the kind of financing instruments needed? We need financing instruments that do not unduly raise our debt. And we need financing that does not, in general, raise debt, which means that we need mainly either grant-based financing or highly concessional financing. But here's the issue. We are considered high-income countries based on per capita GDP. And therefore, countries like ours are not eligible, except under what is called a small economies exception for a few countries in the Caribbean. We're not eligible for concessional funding. And that is why we have been advocating for the use of the multi-vulnerability index as a complementary tool for the World Bank and the other MDBs to take into account that per capita income does not reflect our climate vulnerabilities. So that's one of the first key piece. There's some other innovative financing instruments like debt pause clauses, parametric insurance, debt swaps, that sort of thing that we could always discuss a little more during the discussion. But I want to close up this piece by indicating that at the same time, while we do have an extremely difficult situation in the Caribbean, we as a region, we've been punching above our weight. You've seen the tremendous work that AOSIS has done and will continue to do for the Caribbean. We've seen Prime Minister Motley emerge as a major champion for development and climate, right? Not only for the Caribbean, but for all developing countries. She's championed the Bridgetown Initiative, which we could speak about in some more detail. But she has also assumed presidency of the CVF V20, which means that we now have a chance to link a lot of the international reform initiatives closer to the specific needs of the Caribbean. And also link that to, and somehow we seem to forget that just 6 months ago, we had Abbas, right? Right, the Antigua and Barbuda action agenda for SIDS that somehow seems to have maybe fallen off the radar yet, but is extremely important that all these come together so that we could find and chart a path forward for the region. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much. I think you have followed on from Dr. Mohan quite nicely and gave us some more perspective from an international finance of lens. So, but I would like to pick up on something that you mentioned. You mentioned the case of Suriname and the debt restructuring situation. So I would like us to explore this further. What are the potential benefits and drawbacks of debt restructuring as a strategy for addressing the climate debt trap?
So the first thing to note is that we have a number of instruments, right? As I said, we have debt pause clauses, we have debt swaps, we have debt restructuring could come after, but they have to form part of a portfolio of instruments. There's no one instrument that will help solve the situation that we are in the Caribbean, right? And I'll give you, so you mentioned Suriname. Suriname is amongst the most heavily indebted SIDS. So not only in the Caribbean, but among SIDS worldwide, right? So Suriname's debt is at now beyond 100% of GDP. Suriname's debt servicing is at least 15% of revenues and rising, right? And therefore, when we start to talk about whether debt restructuring would make sense, it would have to be considered in the short term. We need instruments that would still provide financing so that the very same projects that we're talking about could be done, right? The very same bankable projects that are identified could come to fruition. So in the short to medium term, we still need that financing. But even with that financing, given where debt is so unsustainable for many Caribbean countries, then a debt restructuring has to take place. But the history of our debt restructuring is what we call too little, too late, right? The Caribbean has seen close to about 20 episodes of debt restructuring in the last 20 years, right? So that's almost one a year, right? And despite those debt restructuring episodes, all we've done is either reduce interest rate or push the tenor out more. So effectively what we've done is kick the can down the road. We haven't really dealt with the overall debt stock reduction, which is extremely critical. So that's our experience is too little, too late, because by the time we decide to restructure debt, we're already in a crisis. And in the global financial architecture, the only way that you'll be able to restructure that debt is having an IMF program. And we know many Caribbean countries are also loath to go into fund programs. But if they wait too long, they have little choice. That's how the architecture is set up, right? And therefore, it means that when we start to talk about debt restructuring, we'll need to start talking around debt cancellation and debt forgiveness, right? At some point, that conversation also has to be placed squarely on the table. Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I have another question for you. I saw a question come up in the chat, and I think it really follows on. And while Ms. Jattansingh and Dr. Granderson, while you have not yet made your presentations, please feel free. I want this to be a very interactive session. Please feel free to jump in where you see fit. But the real question I want to ask Jwala and anyone else who would like to pick it up as well, this question is, we talk about financing, we talk about restructuring, we talk about the whole concept of from austerity to prosperity. And I want to understand what are innovative financing mechanisms, because now we're hearing more about innovative financing, different ways. And Dr. Mohan, you did touch on some of the ways in which we could channel some of our projects innovatively. But what are some of the innovative financial mechanisms, such as blue, green bonds, that are most viable for Caribbean SIDS, for our reality in meeting their climate resilience and adaptation goals? Anyone could jump in, Jwala.
You want me to jump in first? Because I seem to be dominating the conversation.
No, after this question,
I just take it at a general, right? I'll leave some of the specifics for my colleagues. So you raise like blue bonds and green bonds, right? So these are thematic bonds. But here's the thing. Even when you issue the bond, at the end of the day, you're incurring debt, right? And therefore, that has to be done in the context of a particular capital market transaction where either your net debt, right, remains the same or doesn't go up, or that your net debt servicing is actually lower than it was before. Right? Those to me are the kind of things that we need to talk about when we're looking at from a financial point of view. Now, there are some other things around where on KPIs, key performance indicators, where they need to be linked to the particular projects that they're going to finance, particularly the needs of the local communities, the needs of the indigenous, right, people. And Dr. Mohan talked about, some of the things like the ecosystem-based adaptation and the fact that nature-based solutions are really where we should be looking at in the Caribbean versus the old gray solutions that we see. I mean, when I came back not last week, just a few days, I saw this ad in the newspapers from the Ministry of Works and Transport in Trinidad and Tobago, all right, boasting about coastal protection. And every single coastal protection work that they've done involved concrete, right? There was no mention of mangroves. There was no mention of coral reefs. There was no mention of seagrasses. There was no mention of what was the input that came from the local communities. Absolutely nothing. So I'll leave it here.
Geneva, if I could
Thank you.
just add to the conversation. Before I go into the innovative financing, I would just give one example. I want to just get back to the conversation on the debt and climate change. So in the international discussions, in the policy discussions, as well as in academia, there is a belief that climate change may actually not be driving debt in the Caribbean or other developing countries. And I want to say that we as academics in the region, we have a responsibility to investigate these issues and to ventilate them out there to show, in fact, that there is a direct link between climate change and our high public debt levels. And I can say this confidently because of my own research, where we've investigated tropical storms in the Eastern Caribbean. And we've shown that on average, storms per year increase debt in the Eastern Caribbean by 8%. Their public debt to GDP ratio increases by 8% because of tropical storms. And in the case of highly destructive storms, this debt can actually increase by as much as 132%. So I just want to put that out there in the debt conversation. Looking at the innovative financing mechanisms, I'm going to give an example of blue bonds. Of course, Jwala listed the problems around bonds, but I think it's a good example of where innovation is occurring in the region and an example of where we can learn. So in the Bahamas, they are currently engaging in developing blue bonds and going to a blue bond carbon market. So some of these things are easier said than done. So to begin this blue bond development, what you need to first engage in is a comprehensive survey of your seagrass, because the bond is tied to their large seagrass. And they were able to actually co-opt the expertise to do this. This alone is a formidable task, and they should really be applauded that they are in the process of surveying their seagrass to now issue this blue bond. So once a surveying has occurred, they would tie these blue bonds to the value of their seagrass. Following this, then a blue carbon credit market can be developed. So there are many steps to be taken before these benefits can be realized. And as Jwala said, many difficulties. But I just want to make the point that it is happening in the region and we need to press forward.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, both Jwala and Preeya and Dr. Mohan for the interventions. I would now like to go over to our next presenter, Ms. Sasha Jattansingh, our loss and damage expert. And we're looking at adaptation, addressing loss and damage. And we're also following on from the discussions that we have had thus far. So I now hand over to you to make your presentation, and then we would enter into more discussions.
So thanks very much, Geneva. And I really like this discussion on, what is the landscape for climate finance and especially facing Caribbean SIDS and bringing in that debt angle, which I think is so very important. And then looking at what are some of the innovative financing mechanisms that are around that have, started to be developed and utilized in Caribbean countries. And I think I guess it's important to look at climate finance and debt and look at that link with loss and damage, right? And because we have that sort of like very interlinked issues where where you have this like almost vicious cycle of whenever a natural disaster, hurricane hits, for example, in the Caribbean, you have to somehow immediately finance the recovery and rebuilding costs. And that most likely will mean you'll have to borrow. And then another hurricane will hit the following year. And you have to start that cycle over and over again. And I really like, after Hurricane Beryl, Prime Minister Dickon Mitchell said that we cannot borrow ourselves out of debt, right? It's not feasible. So we really need to start having this conversation and start looking at how does debt affect the Caribbean and how does it factor into climate finance and access to climate finance, and looking at how the loss and damage fund should be designed. And, I've been talking a lot on loss and damage and so on, and not really going into, what exactly it is. And just to know that this term has been around for like 30 years, and we still don't have an agreed upon definition for it. We still don't have an agreed upon definition for climate finance as well. But, loss and damage could be broadly understood as the adverse impacts of climate change that occur despite or in absence of actions to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or mitigation, and to build resilience or adjust to current and future climate change adaptation. So loss and damage, it could occur from extreme weather events like hurricanes, droughts, and floods, as well as slow onset events like sea level rise, desertification, and glacial retreat. And we could, categorize loss and damage as either economic or non-economic. And economic losses and damage, that's a lot easier to kind of quantify and assign any sort of monetary value, because it's any sort of adverse effects on anything that could be commonly traded in markets, so resources, goods, and services. So that could be, the cost of rebuilding infrastructure and property destroyed during a hurricane, or, the loss of revenue from the loss of agricultural produce due to flooding. Non-economic loss and damage, on the other hand, it's a lot harder to assign a monetary value. And non-economic loss and damage includes, loss of biodiversity or ecosystems, trauma from experiencing a hurricane, or loss of cultural identity and cultural heritage due to climate disasters and also due to climate migration. So even though non-economic loss and damage is more difficult to quantify and monetize, it can have detrimental and long-lasting impacts on well-being and quality of life for communities. And also, I'd like to say for Caribbean small islands, where our, being part of a small island is part of our identity, how does loss of, our territory due to sea level rise, how will that affect our livelihoods, our way of life, what it means to be Caribbean? And and you realize now it goes into things that are not easily quantified and monetized. So loss and damage and financing for loss and damage is becoming a lot more complex. And, we've had the loss and damage fund that, it's been hotly debated. I think, the negotiators actually thought that never in their lifetime they would see a loss and damage fund being established. And then lo and behold, in 2022 at COP29 in Sharm el-Sheikh, we had a loss and damage fund agreed and the new funding arrangements. But interestingly, in order to get that agreement to happen, that COP decision said that this new fund and funding arrangements would be based on cooperation and facilitation and not involve liability or compensation. And that echoes from the Paris Agreement, where we had the first standalone article on loss and damage, Article 8, which also includes, the agreement actually also includes the same line that, Article 8 on loss and damage does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. So we're seeing that, we have a loss and damage fund. We're talking about the need for loss and damage finance, but there are issues surrounding who is going to finance the fund, how is it going to be financed, and then also what is going to be financed. And now we see that we have the new, the official name of the fund is the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. So whereas, for a long time and historically, Caribbean countries have been reporting on loss and damage. And we see that from, the damage and loss assessments and the post-disaster needs assessment that we do after any sort of major climate events. So mainly hurricanes and flooding events. And we tend to look at, the estimated cost of losses and damages, particularly economic loss and damage as a result of the climate event. But the fund isn't actually going to pay compensation for that. What the fund is doing, and it's actually in the name, is that it's going to actually finance activities or actions that would respond to addressing loss and damage. So we need to look at costing these sorts of responses and activities, planned or future activities, in order to be able to access loss and damage. And this was a conundrum that I remember realizing. And Climate Analytics Caribbean, we did a comprehensive assessment of loss and damage for the Caribbean region. And the report was released earlier this year in June. It's called a Review of Loss and Damage in the Caribbean, 1994 to 2024. And, the reason for that was despite, having widespread loss and damage, that has been experienced throughout the Caribbean, there wasn't actually any comprehensive assessment of loss and damage in the region. So some of the research questions were, how is loss and damage being framed in the region? What were the existing tools, methodologies, and mechanisms that have been used to assess loss and damage? And what was the extent of loss and damage that has been experienced by the region? And what are the projected future costs of loss and damage for the region? And it was all desktop-based. And some of the key findings was that, even though we don't have an internationally agreed upon definition of loss and damage has always been framed as a climate justice issue by Caribbean SIDS, requiring international support as opposed to national responsibilities. And then what's also quite important to note is that 9 out of the 14 CARICOM countries actually mention loss and damage in their latest nationally determined contributions. So at that international stage, we've been highlighting the importance of loss and damage and the importance of us having to finance loss and damage. And a lot of our reporting on loss and damage has been focused on mainly, economic and non-economic loss and damage from hurricanes and floods. And we've excluded other climate hazards that affect the Caribbean, like drought or heat waves, and sea level rise, which we need to start including. And I think going back to how we're able to access the fund, one of the key recommendations that came out of that report was the need to develop and use a common regional approach for loss and damage assessments and reporting. Because, as I said, there's no official definition of loss and damage out there. But in order for the Caribbean to start positioning ourselves to be able to access the loss and damage fund and to be able to increase the amount of climate finance coming into the region for, loss and damage response and actions, it would be useful for us to lead on developing and using a standard framing and scoping for loss and damage assessments and reporting, and developing a standard definition and a standard approach and methodology. So we could now say, this is what we mean when we talk about loss and damage for the region, and this is how we are assessing loss and damage, and these are our costing of activities and actions to respond to loss and damage. So we position ourselves quite nicely to say we are ready and give us the money. So I think I'll stop there.
Thank you very much for that context. I think I learned a thing or two just hearing you say what really is happening right now. What's the state of play into this particular facility, this particular tool. And in the civil society sector, many persons are looking out for this. They are hinging a lot of the decisions up on this. However, it has taken so long to even be operationalized. Many of us have become daunted with the approach, and now we're talking about capitalization, we're talking about access, we're talking about different things that are not yet. So after 2 years, we are now at the place where we have an office for it, we have an executive director, but then how long before we get to the other parts of it? So my question really is, what is the appetite amongst within the international community, amongst larger countries to fund this? And is there a possibility that funding may come from the private sector as well? What are we hearing on the ground? I know that you're in space quite heavily, and just to get a sense of what's happening moving forward and what to expect as well post COP in.
Mm-hmm. So right now, and since actually COP28, the fund has only been capitalized by about 700 million US. There hasn't been any new pledges since then. But at COP29, the finance COP, we're expecting that there will be more pledges from developed countries. And also noting that, we have the new collective quantified goal on climate finance being negotiated. And one critical need to ensure that we have adequate and sufficient loss and damage finance is to include a specific sub-goal for loss and damage. And the amount of financing assigned to that should be on par with mitigation finance, because, for years, mitigation finance has been prioritized rather than adaptation, and then now loss and damage. And, recent studies actually indicate that loss and damage needs by developing countries are actually in the trillions every year. So 700 million is clearly not enough. And I like to give this example in terms of context on how much 700 million actually is. So when Hurricane Maria plummeled through Dominica in 2017, the estimated loss and damage was about 1.2 billion US, which is about 226% of Dominica's GDP. So 1.2 billion in estimated loss and damage, and that was from a single climate event in a single year affecting one single country. So you could see now that this money is clearly not enough. And what it is with the fund and the completion of the operationalization of the fund, looking at the design of the fund, the access criteria, eligibility criteria, and so on, the fund should definitely be responsive and flexible, and it should be sufficiently capitalized to address the scale and urgency of the needs of developing countries for loss and damage finance. And I like that Jwala raised the multi-dimensional vulnerability index, the MVI, which was agreed by the UN General Assembly earlier this year. And that is one important tool. It still has to be refined and so on, that can be used as one of the eligibility criteria to access the fund. So that will give a better representation of what is climate vulnerability and which countries are able to access the monies and why, and not only looking at GDP. Because if we use GDP, which is what is often used as a eligibility criteria for climate finance, then you notice that that Caribbean SIDS are excluded because, as Preeya said, we tend to have higher GDPs for the rest of the SIDS regions, right? And it's not because it's not because we are, more economically productive or anything like that, right? It's just because our costs of living and so on are a lot higher. So that is one way to look at eligibility criteria and how the fund could be more responsive. Another important aspect is looking at who could access the fund and what are the mechanisms to ensure that the monies in the fund get to communities and countries in a timely manner. And, one of the recommendations is the need for direct access and simplified access. So I know Preeya mentioned, the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund and so on, but these applications for these current funds, they're so onerous. The amount of data and information you need in order to access this. And then it takes about 3 years or more to go from, a project concept proposal to actually get monies from the Green Climate Fund. You cannot have that happening for a loss and damage fund. We need money soon after a climate event in order to respond effectively to meet the immediate needs and so on. So it's quite useful to look at direct access to countries and simplified access, and also looking at also having a specialized window of small grants for communities and civil society who are working in the loss and damage space to be able to access funds directly from the loss and damage fund. And also it's quite useful to note that, the loss and damage fund should focus on highly concessional finance, particularly grants, right? To ensure that we don't exacerbate or increase the debt burdens of climate vulnerable countries dealing with loss and damage and trying to recover from loss and damage. And in terms of who should contribute to the funds, that's where the new funding arrangements are that's that aspect of it. Like, what are the sources of funding? And, developing countries are really focused on including the fund should be financed by developed countries and also have it, be allowed to be open to other contributors, if it's private sector, if it's philanthropic organizations and so on. And then looking at what are the procedures, transparency and accountability procedures to ensure that the money is going there, meet the needs and so on. So I think these are discussions that are happening. And I think we've all realized that, we need, just given the scale of the quantum of monies needed for loss and damage, we need to look at where else we could get finance from. And also noting that, we tend to talk about climate finance and loss and damage finance and so on, and we focus only on, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, but noting that here mightn't be the best place to consider all these other issues, particularly with compensation, since I've said they've ring-fenced compensation and liability. We cannot include that at all when looking at loss and damage finance. However, we have other mechanisms that you could approach this. So, as Jwala mentioned, we have the Bridgetown Initiative 3.0, also a lot of work and advocacy on the reform of the international financial architecture. Then we also have advisory opinions from, the various international courts of justice. We had the advisory opinion on the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea happening on climate change. We have the ICJ advisory on climate change. We also have the International Human Rights Court of Justice advisory coming out. So this will really open up the space, I think, on looking at that compensation issue. in loss and damage. So it's interesting times. So it will be quite important for the Caribbean to provide our voice and our input into these discussions that are emerging. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Mohan, I saw you.
Yeah, I would like to make 2 quick points following from Sasha's discussion on the loss and damage. In terms of the methodology, we really need to have a standardized methodology across the world to really measure loss and damage if we're going to access the funds. Before we can even access the funds, we need to measure loss and damage. And the International Institute for Environment and Development has actually developed a comprehensive climate impact quantification tool, which is a 5-step procedure that looks at economic and non-economic loss and damage. And it really is an inclusive participatory approach where you go out and you collect the quantitative data, but you also carry out a lot of focus groups in terms of the communities on the ground to understand the non-economic losses of loss and damage. And that project is across 25 countries at the moment, with Dominica being one of them. I'm actually doing the project for Dominica. So I want to just put out there that, there are steps being taken in terms of a standardized approach to loss and damage. The other point I want to make is in terms of the operationalization of the loss and damage fund. I think it's important that we have parametric triggers attached to the fund. So Sasha made the point of immediate access to finance. So loss and damage finance is very different from climate finance. Climate finance addresses adaptation and mitigation. Loss and damage is supposed to address the impacts of disasters. After disaster occurs, you need immediate access to finance for relief, cleanup, food, water, etc., medication. Parametric triggers would ensure that there is a predefined threshold when a disaster occurs so that funding becomes immediately available, whether it's based on wind speed, precipitation, storm surge. You don't want to be carrying out surveys in terms of loss and damage after the event, because that prolongs access to finance. You want to have a trigger in place. If a Category 5 hurricane hits Dominica this time, this is the funding that should be accessed. And that, in a nutshell, is the benefit of a parametric trigger. Very similar to parametric insurance, which, again, we have pioneered here in the Caribbean.
Thank you very much. And now I'd like to go on to our other segment, but I don't want to lose the momentum that we have. Dr. Granderson, please give me the opportunity. Also, listeners, participants, I would like to also reserve some of your beautiful questions, very interesting questions for at the end of the session. However, I have 3 questions I would like to pose to the panelists right now, and that's in terms of direct access to funding in relation to the loss and damage fund, direct access. What is the role of CRIF SPC as a possible entity through which direct access can perhaps happen more efficiently and more effectively, given that they give liquidity support, or their mandate release to give liquidity support within the first 72 hours of a disaster event? And I see Mr. Gardner, thank you very much for your question. Ms. Jattansingh, the question is in relation to capitalization, increasing damage, debt, disruption in larger economies. We know what's going on in Germany in terms of their rise in debt. Make it less likely that external financing needed by the Caribbean is made available. And then Ms. Sindh-Bright, thank you for your question as well. She asked, can the panelists comment on why the requirements for these major climate funds are so onerous, and then who is actually benefiting from these funds? What percentage of these funds are being spent on administration as opposed to addressing tangible needs for frontline vulnerable communities? So if you could address that before we go on to the other segment, we would really appreciate it, because I too would like to hear the answers coming from panel.
Sure. So I guess I could start with the question on CRIF. And yes, CRIF, CRIF actually is a homegrown solution that came out of our experience, and particularly Grenada's experience with Hurricane Ivan, and Caribbean countries, saw the need to be able to have a need for quick liquidity following a natural disaster. And CRIF is designed as the first regional catastrophe fund to allow Caribbean governments to really limit the impact of devastating hurricanes, earthquakes, and so on by quickly providing financial liquidity when any sort of policy is triggered. And when I was speaking on direct access, there, one of the requirements is the organizations or institution that will be able to channel funds to countries and communities on the ground. They're looking more to regional and national entities rather than international entities, which might have a lot more administrative burdens and so on. That's commonly used, in the GCF. So CRIF could actually be a regional direct access entity for the Loss and Damage Fund, given their track record, and also given the fact that CRIF is used as a case study and a best practice when we're looking at how loss and damage finance can be disbursed quickly and efficiently to countries that need it, and looking at trigger-based mechanisms and how that could be incorporated into the design of the fund. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Jwala.
I'm not convinced that CRIF should play a role in the L&D fund, because one of the things is simply this. If CRIF is so efficient already in terms of what it does, why should it then receive funding from the L&D fund when that similar capitalization could have come to CRIF itself, right? So that's the first part. So for the moment, I'm not saying no to it or yes, but I think it's something that requires a lot more thought. But I think what is important is that at least the CRIF's role in natural disaster finance in the Caribbean has to be expanded and strengthened. I think there's a lot more that CRIF could do. And apart from the global level in terms of the financing, CRIF is also involved in what we call some of the micro-insurance initiatives, right? Primarily through the Global Shield, which is a V20 initiative. And I think those are some of the things that need to be strengthened, because that is now funding reaches the communities that are affected, right? For example, the fishermen, the agricultural persons, versus a country gets hit and there's flooding, and the funds come to the government and they reach into the national budget and the government does what it wants with it. And then you hear the persons affected say, well, we didn't get any money, right? So I think there is a role for CRIF, but from a different level. Now, there's another very important point that Sasha mentioned there, and that is, if tomorrow the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage said, hey, Caribbean guys, I have money here for you, come and take it, would we be ready to access? And the answer is no. And that means that there's a lot of work that we need to do, and Sasha's pointed out some of the areas, Preeya's pointed out some of the areas that we need to actually have technical assistance on and training on, ready to. And third point is that we just need to have different funds to be able to access them. They're just not, so CRIF is one. I expanded CRIF, a fund for responding to loss and damage, and there's another initiative coming through from the as liquidity support that will take place without raising debt in these countries. So I think those are the kind of initiatives that we need to be talking about, and we could access funds and where we need to.
Thank you very much. Thank you for those interventions. Thank you. I would now like to hand this session over to Dr. Ainka Granderson. Dr. Granderson, you have been hearing the deliberations. You have heard what came before by way of climate finance and loss and damage fund, the intersection with debt and climate change, and the needs of communities, including vulnerable communities, because we heard about economic and non-economic impacts of these events. So I now hand over to you to give us a presentation on civil society and climate change, on climate governance, and hear a little bit more about your perspective and have that injected into the wealth of information that we have heard so far.
Hey, thanks for that, Geneva. I might actually go back first and respond to the question that I think it's Ms. Bryce asked about the onerousness of the climate funds. So I've been engaging with the Green Climate Fund, so I can speak to that one, the GCF. So part of it is that they're new, and I think they're working through kinks. So there's this constant sort of shifting in what are the criteria, what are the templates. And there's also, I think, still a very sort of risk-averse approach to giving out financing from these large funds, where they want you to cross all the T's, dot all the I's, sign away your grandparents, etc., before they give you any funding. And so I think that's one of the major issues in terms of why it's so onerous. But also, there has been, I think, a recent shift because there is so many complaints, particularly from developing countries, including ourselves as SIDS, in terms of trying to streamline and simplify the process, and just, thinking that it's not acceptable that it takes, 3-4+ years to get the funding. When you put in a proposal, it's just not acceptable based on the urgency of the problem. And so there is, I think, an effort for GCF as well as the Adaptation Fund, JEF, etc., to actually kind of streamline and somewhat standardize their processes. I know they're working on a sort of joint application framework and these types of things, which I think will help to smoothen the process. And then in terms of your points about administration costs and how much of it is spent on that, they do have caps in terms of how much you can spend on administration or overhead. I actually think the bigger issue is that tons of money goes to consultants and not necessarily to concrete implementation on the ground. And so that's a whole other, I think, fight that we will need to try to address as part of improving the structure and efficiency of how those large funds work. But then to get to the meat of the question, which is kind of how does this all kind of affect civil society, what's their role, and how can they kind of better engage in the process? So I think, everyone's been talking about COP29, which is the focus of our talk, which is the climate finance COP. And I think it's important to think both about how we're improving the quantity, but also the quality of the finance that's being provided, and how do we negotiate for that as part of the new collective climate finance goal, as well as part of other discussions, for example, around the global loss and damage funds. So I think from a civil society perspective, I started to give some stats when I was doing my initial opening, because I wanted to kind of set the stage to say, there's some real key barriers that I think we need to address to ensure that we can better engage, but also improve access to funds right down to the ground, including to frontline communities that are most at risk, but also to the civil society organizations that work with them and serve them. And some of the, I think, key barriers that we really need to address as we move forward is there are capacity constraints that I think civil society organizations themselves recognize. So there's the fact that project, financial management, reporting, auditing, all these things are real capacity constraints within the sector. And these are key requirements for many funders. So we need to address these types of things. I think also this onerous process for applying is a significant barrier. And the fact that there's limited proposal development capacity, especially among the many smaller CSOs that make up the sector in our region, and who have limited experience and awareness of many of these newer funds like the GCF. I think there's also issues around being aware of the different finance options. So we've been hearing about innovative things like debt for climate swaps, blue bonds, green bonds, and these other things. And I think civil society is not always fully kind of aware of all the different options that are available and ways to access funding. And then I think another barrier that we don't always discuss is that I think government engagement with civil society on climate change programs and in decision-making processes is often ad hoc without established structures in place, in many instances at the national level. So it makes it kind of difficult for them to insert themselves in the process and be able to influence what's happening in terms of priorities, where the funding is going in, tracking it, etc. So in terms of some of the things that we're advocating for as we look to COP29 beyond to ensure that we are meeting the needs of those on the ground, is firstly to really embrace the whole of society approach and ensure that representatives of these groups are actually engaged in the design, the implementation, the monitoring, the evaluation, and that we're really tapping into their expertise and ensuring that initiatives are tailored to needs of those that we're trying to actually benefit and serve. I also think we can design these funding mechanisms to better support readiness and capacity building support for civil society organizations and communities that are trying to access these funds to strengthen their policies, their systems, their human resources to deliver on these finance and have more effective interventions and also scale up impact. I think we can also think about how do we engage civil society to help improve access to information on local climate impacts and viable solutions, because there's a lot of citizen science and local and indigenous knowledge that I think is very relevant to the discussions we're having, and that's not always integrated into the process. And then in terms of how we actually get funding to the ground, and this is actually also applicable, I think, to the Global Loss and Damage Fund, is we have to think about how we use small and medium-sized grant mechanisms to really design them and cater to the needs of those who are most vulnerable and trying to deliver meaningful climate action or respond to the impacts of hurricanes and major disasters that they're experiencing. And we need this to be designed to be more patient, predictable, and I think programmatic. So none of these kind of very piecemeal, small amounts, but really thinking about how do we support work over multiple years. And I think part of the thing that we have to focus on is the role of local intermediaries or homegrown intermediaries, if you will, who have experience in running these types of mechanisms and can help to better channel finance to the local level and really work with those on the ground to actually deliver these things. So these may be poor female-headed households, small-scale farmers and fisher folk, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples. I think we really need to think about how we make this work for them, and also recognize that I think our homegrown intermediaries are probably better placed, have better relationships, have better trust to be able to support this rather than some of the big international intermediaries like the UN agencies. And then I think finally, we need to have better coordination mechanisms and partnerships among the different key stakeholders to really support this process. And so I think in the introduction, it was mentioned that CANARI, the group that I work with, co-convenes the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. And so I just wanted to point out that there's real value in coming together and amplifying our voices so we can have more impact and better advocate for the changes that we want to see in terms of climate justice, building local resilience, and ensuring that we're getting the funding to those who most need it. And so, we have a collective agenda up to 2030 that outlines priorities, including on climate finance. And I can share a link in the chat. And I think it's important to really come together and work with each other to ensure that we're able to have the impact that we want to see.
Thank you very much, Dr. Granderson. Much of what you say has so much relevance. I mean, civil society really, they're really the interlocutors between what's happening on the ground and government. As someone who would have worked in government and civil society and the private sector, I understand the role of civil society in translating some of the realities to some of the other actors, especially when sometimes we sit in our policy chairs and we don't have access to on-the-ground data. So that question is, we appreciate the relevance of civil society engagement, especially now more than ever, in the climate change, climate policy, climate finance, international financial reform space. But the question is, how can we enhance the coordination and collaboration between or amongst the different actors so that who are involved in climate finance and climate change reforms, government, international organizations, the private sector. I see that some international organizations are opening up spaces for civil society to have a voice. But to what extent is it really being translated into the policy space to really activate change or influence change? So what do you think are some of the key areas or modalities that can be engaged to increase that coordination, that collaboration among civil society and other actors, whether state or non-state?
So I think that's a really good question. And I think there's also a lot of tokenism. So that's what we need to try to avoid. There's a lot of, oh, we'll make sure there's a gender representative, a youth representative, and those types of things, but there's not really meaningful interest in ensuring that those voices are included. And so I'll give an example, which actually is regional, that I think is interesting and could be something that could be replicated. So we were the implementing partner for a Green Climate Fund readiness project over kind of 3.5-year period a few years ago. And one of the things that we did was we co-convened with the government of Jamaica through their national designated authority to the fund, which is the Ministry of Economic Growth and Job Creation, Caribbean Climate Finance Action Network, where we basically invited all the climate finance and climate change focal points from the government across CARICOM, civil society organizations, private sector, including local development banks, and the regional technical agencies that are key, like the 5 Cs, sub-regionally, like the OECS Commission, to be part of that network. And we actually worked together over 2 years to really talk about the key challenges that are facing us in the region around climate finance. So, how do we tackle the fact that there's so little direct access to finance? How do we, address the fact that we have only a few direct access entities? How do we streamline, make ourselves better able to get through the accreditation process, to get funds? Also, how do we make governance more inclusive and participatory and have more multi-stakeholder engagement? So we addressed some key questions around this and really kind of facilitated a process that was about problem solving and sharing and brainstorming solutions. It was very solution oriented. So it wasn't just complain about what's happening, but how do we actually tackle it using specific facilitation techniques? And I think it was very interesting because at the end of the process, we did see that a number of the, for example, national designated authorities who were the persons who are the focal points for many of these funds, kind of shifted kind of how they were operating in terms of thinking about how do we make our committees more multi-stakeholder and inclusive? How do we ensure that there are things in the pipeline that are actually trying to engage civil society, even thinking about making sure that we're getting finance for them to support work on the ground, having them be executing entities. So no, I think that's the kind of dialogue and networking partnerships that we want to be fostering if we're really going to tackle this issue effectively and have that whole of society approach.
Thank you very much for that. I always try to see how best we could formalize a process so that there'll be, as you mentioned earlier, predictability in terms of civil society meeting. Is there a possibility that governments could perhaps have a town hall session that could facilitate things? What is it? What more can we put in place? Because we seem to have the mechanisms, but we're not really utilizing them or stretching them to an extent. So I'm glad that you mentioned those solutions that you did. Now, I know that we're running a little short on time, so I would jump straight to the questions from the audience. And because I realize in the chat there's quite an enriching discussion taking place alongside the panel discussions. So now the panelists really want in on that. So thank you very much to all the participants who've been contributing. I understand the need for us to really push our agenda towards more sustainable, more resilient development. So I'll just jump into some of the questions that I see here. So just to, how can regional cooperation among Caribbean SIDS enhance their bargaining power in international climate finance negotiations, especially in the lead up to COP29. Whoever wants to take a dab at that.
Okay, I'll go first. So definitely, I think Caribbean countries need to solidify what our priorities and our positions are, and that's already happened. It's CARICOM and the 5Cs did have a pre-COP session for Caribbean negotiators, and the position on climate finance and loss and damage and so on is out there. I think probably it hasn't been well communicated, and I think also this is an opportunity to see how, other voices, academia, so how can the UE be involved in the pre-COP? How can civil society be involved to provide inputs and recommendations to guide the negotiations? Because we're looking at opening up spaces for civil society and non-state actors to participate in the negotiations. And while they may not go to COP, they've been involved in providing information and views and so on. And in terms of the regional position, it's definitely aligned with the Alliance of Small Island States, AOSIS position on the need for the NCQG to have specific sub-goals for mitigation, loss and damage, and adaptation for the quantum to be at the level that meets the urgency and scale of the climate finance needs for developing countries, and also to ensure the importance of the special circumstances of SIDS to be continued to be recognized in access to climate finance, because I think various panelists here have really outlined that even though climate finance is available, we have all these various funds and so on. Caribbean SIDS have actually had the least amount of access to the funds available, and it's already limited funds, so we're getting about 2% of what exists, right? So it's really to highlight and showcase that we need more ambitious and scaled up climate finance, and we need to have simplified and improved and easy access to climate finance, whether it's from the Green Climate Fund, whether it's from the Loss and Damage Fund, and so on. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Anyone else would like to take a job at it?
I could jump in here quickly. I agree with what Sasha has said. There's some other areas too, when I look at it like from a civil society perspective, that we need, in general, there's need for a more inclusive approach. If you look at the various COPs, Caribbean SIDS they're well represented, but not as a cohesive unit, as a one voice, as one unified voice. Because you'll have government, you'll have civil society, you'll have a few of the think tanks, and maybe some of the other agencies that are doing work in the region, right? And wherever they are aligning themselves. But you don't see like one space that says, here when we speak, we're speaking on behalf of all Caribbean SIDS. And part of that too is that, as you're all aware, that there are issues even at the government level in terms of negotiating to be head of the class, right? So we've seen that playing off. But I think where some of the support is, and this is not only for COP29, but in terms of how we go beyond, is that there's a lot of extremely good research work being done. That research has to now be translated into a level of advocacy to get that kind of voice that is needed, and then to move that advocacy into campaigning, specific campaigns. And that is what is missing to me in the region. We don't have a strong campaign on, let's say, climate finance, our climate gap. our climate debt trap. We do not have campaigns like that not only hit that go straight to the heart of the matter and capture people's attention. And that is where we need to really and truly focus on building off on a lot of the good research work that has been done.
Geneva,
Mohan?
I wanna make a point in terms of regional collaboration for climate projects. So oftentimes we are excluded from accessing funds because the projects are simply too small, and the administration involved in a small sum, it just makes it more difficult for us to access funding. So by collaborating together on regional projects through CARICOM, for instance, we can in fact increase our chances of accessing the fund. We have had some regional projects, but we need to see more.
Thank you very much. Three different perspectives and three very critical points. Dr. Granderson, this question is for you. And these questions so far, the first one and this one now is from Ms. Therese Batiste. Thank you very much for participation in our discussion so far. So, Dr. Granderson, how can Caribbean SIDS leverage climate finance to not only address environmental challenges, but also empower social growth, ensuring that climate resilience facilitates sustainable economic opportunities and improve social equity for vulnerable communities? If you want me to repeat that, I can. But really, how can Caribbean SIDS leverage that climate finance that we were told that is circulating around? And we're seeking direct access, Sasha, we're seeking the direct access to really address environmental, social, other types of concerns.
So, I mean, I think there are a few different things that can be done. So, firstly, we need to design the mechanisms to be able to cater to the types of groups that we're trying to meet. So, for example, recently with the enhanced direct access pilot that, for example, the Green Climate Fund and Adaptation Fund have been doing, what we've seen is that the executing entities that have been managing those funds see that there's a lot of administration and trying to provide very small grants, and so they've gone for larger pots of money. But what that means is that it really limits who gets the funding, because most really small community-based organizations can't manage maybe more than like 100,000, to 200,000 maximum US in funds. So if you say you're just giving out grants that are 250,000 above, 500,000 above, etc., you're basically excluding them. So you have to design the mechanisms according to the types of groups that you're catering for. I think also we need to make sure that the requirements for how you access those funds are realistic. So they can't be too onerous. You can't be expecting really vulnerable groups to be providing cash flow finance for these types of grants, unless you're targeting maybe small and micro enterprises where there's the expectation that they would provide co-finance, or they could, pay back very small, low interest loans, etc. So, all of these things are things that we don't really see properly considered when people are setting up mechanisms. And so you really have to think about that. And as I mentioned earlier, also the delivery mechanism. So are you using an intermediary, for example, that can help support capacity building and other kinds of support on the ground with those groups to help them really implement those things effectively, and not to feel really stressed about having to, manage these funds. This capacity building, I think, is also really interesting, because I think combined grant making and capacity building is kind of the way forward. We shouldn't just be throwing funds at people. We should be trying to build up their capacity so they manage those funds effectively. And really our goal is that the next time they can manage more funds. So trying to build up their capacity, but also scale up impacts, because that's what we need to see. So I think there's lots of little things that we can do to better leverage refinance. And I think we also need to think about some of these innovative mechanisms. If you do a debt for climate swap, are you thinking about ways that that funding is going to go to civil society to support what they're doing? It's not just going to, for example, government or private sector. The same for the loss and damage fund. is there a community window that's allowing community groups to access funds so that they can do what they need to do? So I think these are some of the key considerations that we need to be making.
Thank you very much in depth, and I hope that we have some government officials on hearing some of what we're saying, or could be communicated to them in some main way. I'll take one more question from our audience.
I just want to add to what Ainka is saying, and I definitely do agree with how we design these sorts of projects and proposals to access climate finance. The need for looking at capacity building and combining capacity building and grant making, especially for the communities and groups of interest, and then also looking at appropriate technologies. So we tend to always be focusing on innovative finance and innovative technologies. But sometimes we don't consider what is the context and what is the need for, if it's adaptation, for example, in a rural community. So we have to work with the communities and civil society to understand what exactly they need. And when I was in Antigua and Barbuda, we actually had one of the enhanced direct access projects that was regional. It was in Antigua and Barbuda, Grenada, and Dominica, and they utilized their National Environmental Fund, the Sustainable Island Resource Framework Fund, to be able to channel monies from the Green Fund to target vulnerable groups and communities to undertake climate resilience building for physical infrastructure, if it's homes, if it's schools or churches that would have been used as emergency shelters, right? So they've really tried to understand what is the problem and what is the need, and how to design these sorts of mechanisms for the people and communities that most need these funds to reach them. They also were able to utilize the SAFE Fund to create a blended finance window where they gave small and micro enterprises, which would be fishermen, tour operators, and so on. It would be a technical assistance component, so a grant for capacity building, so how to improve financial management and so on, and also a loan where they could help to climate proof their enterprises, right? So you're seeing that they're meeting the needs instead of having all these innovative, what we think as innovative, because really and truly we have to look at what is the need, what is the need, the dire need right now. And what I thought was quite interesting is under this GCF project, in communities, especially those that were along, the rivers, they had a huge mosquito problem. So they were giving, part of it was to provide support, financial support, and so on for these electronic mosquito traps, right? So you see, it's not these innovative, crazy technologies. It's things that we actually need. So we have to look at what it is we want these projects to achieve, what is the impact, and what can be done, looking at what sorts of financial mechanisms we could design, and looking at who it is we really need to meet, what are their needs, and then going ahead and doing it and saying that this is priority. This is our priority for our country in order to build climate resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. So I'm getting that it must be, whatever is, it must be fit for purpose. And that is something we definitely will take into the next COP. I know that a number of the panelists will be heading across. So I think this is a good lead up for COP29 for those who will be going. For those who are not, I welcome the shared experiences and the wealth of information that came from the panel. Unfortunately, we are out of time, unfortunately, because I could probably do this for the 3 hours. So thank you very much, panelists. Thank you very much, audience. I would like to now hand this session over to Dr. Sukram.
Thanks, Geneva. So, hello again, everyone. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today for our panel discussion on the road to COP29, navigating the climate finance landscape for Caribbean SIDS. Now, as we wrap up this event, I want to take a moment to acknowledge several key individuals who made this panel possible. First, I'd like to express my gratitude to Dr. Mohan for not only conceptualizing this important event, but also for assembling such an exceptional panel. Dr. Mohan's visions and commitment to addressing the pressing climate challenges facing our Caribbean small island developing states, or SIDS, have set the stage for continued meaningful dialogue. Also want to extend my appreciation to our moderator, Geneva Oliverie, whose expertise and guidance helped to steer our discussions today. Thank you to all the panelists for sharing your invaluable insights and experiences. Your contributions have greatly enhanced our understanding of the climate finance landscape and the path forward for our region. A sincere thank you goes out to the SALISES staff, especially Cassie, for her hard work in organizing this event and ensuring everything runs so very smoothly. I want to recognize the contributions of our marketing and communications team, particularly Josanne. Her proactive efforts in promoting this event assisted in bringing together a diverse and engaged audience. Along the same vein, I'd like to thank the GICSID, the Global Institute for Climate Smart and Resilient Development, for their assistance in sharing this event with stakeholders, which helped to expand our reach and increase engagement within the community. So thank you once again, all, for being here today and for your commitment to promoting sustainable future for our Caribbean SIDS. Together, we can continue to drive impactful discussions and actions as we navigate the complexities of climate finance. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye.